My name is Nicholas Snow. I'm a second-year MFA candidate at UMass Boston with Arrowsmith Press, and I'm here with...
I'm Romeo Oriogun. I have a chapbook called Museum of Silence, which will be coming out with Arrowsmith Press.
And I'm Mitch Manning. My book, City of Water, is coming out with Arrowsmith in April.
So, your relationship with writing, from the beginning to now, how do you feel that it's changed, both in terms of craft and maybe how you think about your own work? Whoever would like to go first.
Okay, I'll try.
There we go.
I started writing 5 years ago, so it's like been a very long time. I think when I started writing, it was because I had something to say.
Mm-hmm.
I cared less about the craft, I cared less about language or whatever. I think the more I start reading, the more it became how to merge this world I was observing and also witnessing in my poetry with the beauty of the poems that I was reading at that time, right? So over the years, I think my poetry has changed in the sense that it's become a means of interrogating language. While what I write about is very important, the way I write about it, it's more important. So that's where the craft comes in, right? So, and then also because I read lots of theories about writing, like I'm not just interested in writing poems as poems, but also what makes a poem, what makes a poem not just a poem, but a good poem.
Yeah.
So it affects the way I see my own poetry and how I want my poetry to be. And I'm also all about sound. So if a poem doesn't sound the way I want it to sound in my head, I would have to rework till it sounds that way.
Mitch, what about yourself?
I think when I started writing poetry, I wanted to sound like the poets I was reading, because I thought that's what poetry was. And the more I just kept throwing myself at it, the more I realized like the kind of anxiety of influence, like you have to let it go. And so the book, the City of Water book, was really an attempt to try to, carve out my own kind of sense of not just style, but like what a poem is. And the original goal, because I wrote it on this phone, was to have it be one scroll, that it was just one long poem.
Very interesting.
Because I like this poet, Frank Stanford, and he wrote this insane book called The Battlefield Where the Moon Says I Love You. And it's this like hundreds of pages sort of crazy story about like the kind of Louisiana South. And it's this like surreal, carnivalesque, like mystical thing, and it has like almost no punctuation. And it doesn't really work totally. It's like there's a lot of, weirdness. But I kind of realized playing with the book and doing the editing that like there's certain formal constraints that the poem like requires. And there's sort of craft questions that like you have to consider. And if you don't, you're kind of not doing justice to what Romeo's talking about, like that sense of sound, that sense of language, embodying and changing and kind of pushing back at its own meaning. So it's interesting because it's cool.
You've both mentioned poets you're reading and stuff. Who are you guys reading right now?
Well, at the moment, I think because in this phase where I'm not writing much poetry again, right? So I'm more into like the editing phase for my full collection. So I'm just like at the stage where I just want a poem to like wow me. So like it's how do I put it? Like you just wonder about things. You just want a poem to make you wonder about life. So I'm reading Scientificum again for like maybe the fourth, fifth time.
What is the book?
Scientificum by Chris Abani. Fatima Asghar's
If They Come For Us.
If They Come For Us.
You like those poems?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, I would always have a Maria Rocco book with me, so I'm rereading also the Book of Hours.
Yeah, gotta love Rilke. What about yourself, Mitch?
I don't read as much poetry. I read a lot of fiction and a lot of nonfiction. And I just read this French author, Edouard Louis, his book called The End of Eddie. Have you read?
Yeah.
Devastating, like soul-ripping open about a queer kid growing up in rural France. And it's such a savage book, like just savage. And he wrote 3, and his new book is called Who Killed My Father? And he's looking at the kind of structural choices that the French government made that sort of deindustrialized rural France, and so his father's this kind of like rednecky type guy, and it hasn't been published yet. But I thought his writing was so exciting because I love when prose writers can capture a kind of poetic idea. And the way I read poetry is like I sort of am always reading poetry, but I'm not like seeking out collections. I think like Romeo, I'm looking for like the poem, and I love this guy Bob Kaufman. I've been carrying him around. He's really just amazing because I like people that have their own weird vision, and I like this guy. If you read Bolaño, The Savage Detectives, one of the characters is this guy Mario Papaschiaro, and he's like. His book, they finally came out with an English version. It's called Poetry Comes Out of My Mouth. And he was this sort of roaming mad poet, and I like that. Because if you walk around and listen, like there's just so much language all the time, you know, and I think it's an interesting, trying to capture that wildness in language, especially living in the city. I think about that a lot.
You guys ever try your hand at prose? Because you just mentioned this author that was doing poetry prose. Do you guys do that yourself? I mean, Mitch, not Mitch, Romeo, you got the turtle one. That's kind of prosy.
Yeah, but turtle one is actually a folk tale. It's just like writing a story that you've been told, like how the tortoise broke his back. So it's like a childhood story, and anybody growing up that grew up in Nigeria or still growing up in Nigeria right now would just close their eyes and write it. For me, I hold myself to a higher standard when writing prose than poetry. Right, because poetry is something like I just do. Right, whereas prose, I'm more about how does a sentence works. Right, because I'm always more about how you tell something in a different way. Because I believe that everything we want to write about has been either written about, spoken about. As appeared in songs or somewhere, right? So we're retelling our stories.
Yeah.
So when I'm writing prose, I'm more concerned about how I would have to write this old thing, but in a new way, or a new language, a new form, a new kind of telling, right? So it's harder for me.
Yeah.
Although I do write, I think I have a nonfiction out with a journal in Nigeria called Brito Paper. I'm also working on a novel that I've been working for like years now. So and then prose for me is this form of also enjoyment. Like there's no, unlike poetry where people expect you because you're a poet to like always write poems.
Yeah.
Right. So people are always asking, oh, what poem are you working on? Then if you're in a program, it means you always have to like keep churning out poems.
Yeah.
But prose is this place where I go to hide because no one expects you to write prose. So there's no expectation, there's no responsibility. It's just you just running in those wild feet. Yeah.
Sounds nice. Mitch, what about you?
I mean, that was so beautiful.
Yeah.
I don't do prose because I haven't really studied it. I read prose for the poetry, and I read poetry for, I don't know, some other step, you know, like the next space. And for writing prose, it's never, that sense of storytelling comes in like fragments to me. And for me, like, I just think I'm more a fragmented thinker, so poetry for me makes more sense because I can see things in small shards, and the willingness and willfulness to draw a story arc and hold something together, I think is really, that's a great art and an important skill that I lack. So, I mean, I've done, I still want to do more reviews and participate in the literary world too, and I think that's an important way to comment on other people's poems and write about it. But yeah, right now it's more trying to capture those like shards of either language, insight, image, something.
You mentioned the larger literary community. I'm curious if you guys have your own smaller literary communities that you go to for, assistance in revising or generating new things. What is your individual writing community like?
Okay.
Relax, buddy.
No, it's strange. I function in different spaces. So in those different spaces, there are different communities where you belong to because you're there at that moment.
Yeah.
Right. And then when you leave that place, you become part of a different community, right? Like back home in Nigeria, I belong to like this group of friends who write, so we call ourselves like the tribe, right? I'm the only poet, so you have Tolu Daniels, who's an essayist and also a novelist, Adiola and Socrates and TJ Benson, who for me he's kind of like one of the most important voices right now coming out from Nigeria. So I belong to that place, right? And then so I'm here and I'm loving UMass Boston, and I love to be in the community in UMass Boston.
We love you too.
So and yet so when I'm at Harvard at the Hutchins, I'm also among this community of people. So it's the ability to function in multiple spaces, because I think as writing is solitary, but at the same time we're living in a world where it's become less solitary to survive as a writer.
Yeah.
Like, to survive as a writer, you have to like meet people, you have to compare works, you have to talk about it, and even if you work in your own closet or in your own room, there's still this need to like share with editors and have people to comment about your work and everything. So it's kind of like a weird dynamic, but it's also a beautiful thing to just function in multiple spaces and just enjoy functioning in multiple spaces.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important to be able to talk about writing with people and to be able to talk about reading with people and to talk about like books that inspire you, and people that I won't share work with, I'll talk about books and kind of be inspired by that. And being in Boston and the Woodbury Poetry Room and what Christina Davis has created there is such an important space in Boston for like literary community, and I think she's really tried to do that. And UMass has been a great place to connect, and I mean Boston is such a literary place, and there's a lot of great writers here. So, for me, it's like correspondences by email. I have friends like all over the place that I can send work to, and friends out in New York, upstate New York, who you can just like share ideas, and I have a friend who calls me on the phone and he leaves poems on my voicemail. That's nice. And he's the best. And he's just like, he just loves, like, he's like, I wrote this poem, like I'm gonna share it. And that's like the kind of poet he is. And it's really inspiring. And he's so it's like, it's great to be able to have like many different communities and registers to share your work, because I think it's really easy to stay in one community, and it's a real blessing to be able to go between groups, because one group will tell you something and another group will tell you something else. So, I mean, I'm just lucky to have had great teachers here in Boston too, who I've been able to share my work with, and
So we have our communities, and our communities inform our poetry. I'm curious, how do you guys approach revision? You give someone something, they give you some comments. How do you walk away with that, and how do you make the poem go to its next stage?
Wow. It's interesting, right? Like until I came to like the US, it's I really don't have anybody I like send poems to, and then they revise. I'm like, oh, like what you did with the whole, dude, your line breaks a week.
I think it was a little nicer than that.
Man, I know you were not nice. Well, it was nice. It was also because what it made me do was like go back to all my poems and like, okay, I could have done this and done this, and then it looks different on the page, right? So because I've always written poems alone, and then just read it for friends, and like, oh, so they're not bothered because they're also not poets. They're not saying what.
They're not seeing it your way.
Yeah. A poet. No, not really my way, because I think when you write a poem, you already you've seen the way the poem was supposed to be in your head, right? So you can't really revise it further. You need someone, an external person that's not you and who also understands poetry, to be like, oh, it's a good poem, but you could have done this and done this. So it's an interesting dynamics, because sometimes I'm like, I love this line. You don't have to cut it. Yep. And it becomes like very, very sad, because I have a relationship with every line in my poem.
Oh man.
It's like that's like the friends.
Yeah.
Like we're friends. Like because I carry poems inside me, I really don't like, unlike other people who like write one line and then you can come again and write one line. So like what I do is like I write poems inside, and then I sit down, and within 5-10 minutes I'm done with the poem, right? So if there's any poem I can write within 5-10 minutes, I don't think I've ever gone back to
When you say you write inside, do you write in your head or do you write here? Like, is it a feeling that you absorb or is it like lines that you hear?
It's both feelings and lines. So, for example, you're walking down the streets and someone just says something without even knowing it's poetry, right? And you're just like, oh, that line works.
Yeah.
And you just put it there, and it becomes like a spider web, like you're spinning the stuff. And then one day it's like, oh, let me write it down and see how it looks like. And if it works, fine. If it doesn't work, fine. I think maybe to stop one day and I'll start working very hard for poems. Because I really want to know the feeling of working hard for poems.
Yeah. I think a lot about the translation between how you hear it and then how you hear it. So I can write it and hear it, but will you hear it the way I heard it?
Yeah.
And that's like how I play, like the revision process for me has been learning to figure out how does it's like you serve the ball and it comes back. Like can you someone else hear it the way you heard it? Yeah. And I sat down with this guy who used to work here at UMass, Kevin Bowen, and he was the director of the Joyner Institute, and he's an amazing poet and painter. And we sat with the manuscript, and he looked at the poems, and he started moving the ends of lines to the beginning. And it was like looking at the poem in a mirror. Where like I couldn't see, it was like almost like shaving with your other hand in the mirror, where you have to sort of trust that your hand will do it. Yeah. But the way the poem, like the way he was moving these clauses was like, oh, like that's how it's supposed to be heard. Like the way I heard it was through the image, but the sonic sense that you were talking about earlier is what comes across. And so it's just these really slight gradations, and I was like, wow. And it was like looking at a painting in a mirror where you can see like different colors and you can kind of like add to like what you're trying to create. It was, I don't know, it's kind of a mixed metaphor, but it was interesting.
It's also very interesting, and it fascinates me when someone edits a poem and it becomes a different poem entirely.
Yeah.
That's always what I think. I think when someone edits a poem, it becomes something different. But I also think for me, I think what I also write, it's from a sense of like wonder, in the sense like I'm seeing the world with a different eyes. I'm like this child who's seeing this world, who's fascinated by this world, where it be grief, love, joy, or whatever. I think there's a sense of newness to every experience, like we'll see, and like in trying to capture it in a poem. So when someone revises my poem and it becomes something else, I'm like, no.
Territorial, yeah.
So I'm all for the whole tenses and everything, but like that shifting, or like, I can. But I also think, cause another thing I noticed, it's like with the American way of writing poems, it becomes this mechanical. It becomes this mechanical way of writing where you not more
technical,
it's like becomes very technical. It's you're no longer concerned about how like the sound or whatever what you're concerned about. It's like the images and it has to sound this way or this way, which is also a different way of looking at the world and also valid, right? But it also affects different people who are not trained in that tradition, because it's also a tradition of writing, right? So for me, it fascinates me, like the whole American revision and trend.
I think it's like the institutionalization of poetry, because poetry is supposed to be like a free speech kind of act, you know, and the kind of technical nature of poetry can take away that spirit. And like I've read poems that are beautifully technical, but there's like no heart. Like I don't feel that sense of wonder. Because for me, if a poem doesn't have that sense of wonder or like curiosity or like revelation, I don't care like how like well done it is. It's empty. You know, it's just like it's just a well dressed up form. And I find that dangerous because like that's what passes for poetry in a large percentage. And if it's not like really if it's not like bleeding or like hurting or, you know, like ecstatic or, you know, or gone or something, as Reich would say, then I'm like, I shut the page, you know, so.
But for me, it's more, I'm scared of perfect poems, of what we think perfect poems are in the world, right? Because I'm just like, I'm all for the whole impurity of life. I'm all for the whole, this broken beauty, if I can call it that, right? I'm all for Because I strongly believe, and it's just my way of, maybe it's also my way of staying alive, of the sense that everything, it's not done yet. Right? Even living, it's not done yet, so there's always a block to be added, and that's the way I see poetry. So when something is so perfect, and you're like, oh, this is good, right? So it depends on what you want to read a poem for. Like, I read certain poems for beauty, certain poems for language, certain poems for what they want to say. Right? And I don't, like, why I love poetry, I don't really consider whether it's bleeding or not bleeding. What I want to, like, I might read a poem and it just make me happy.
Yeah. I'm the opposite. I want to go to like a very like intense feeling. Like that's what I chase in poetry. Like I like poetry that kind of like can pull out a sense of like displacement or that wonder or you know, something like that, where it kind of like can shift your whole like emotional, spiritual world. And for me, like those are the poems that I'm like wow. And I agree, this idea that like the perfect poem, because even when I read my poems, like I read them differently every time. Like I added all these words when I just read it and like forgot a bunch of words. But like for me, I don't care. Like for somebody else, that's like, they're like, why did you read that word? You forgot that word. And I'm like, I don't know. Like, because it's about like what you're feeling at that time, you know? And that's like, I kind of like why you see a band play live is like a band, if they just play the album, why did you go see them live? Because you could have just listened to the recording. But when they add all sorts of weird stuff, like I think that's what makes it interesting.
I'm also wondering, right? I'm thinking about when you say a poem that leaves you in displacement, and but I'm also thinking some poems lead you home.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's joy.
But exactly. So joy is another one of like the many things that you want to be placed back down.
I totally agree. That's why I'm like, because I'm also like, there's also the trope of the whole, like, a poem must be sad to like touch someone, and you have like lots of, and it's like what sells in like journals, right? People want a poem to bleed. Right. And all of that. And I'm
it
like,
becomes too pathos rich.
Yeah.
It's all about the feeling, and it's not about some of those other senses.
So I'm like, because I always feel like the whole tender moments between even trauma, right? There's always like the human experience is full of tenderness. No matter what you're going through, there are those little pockets of joy, little moments of tenderness. Like take a war, for example. Even in a war, you have people still loving, you have people still smiling, you have at night, maybe by a fireside, people singing. Like, so those little moments, I'm all for that. So
I did a poetry performance with we did a project with the country of Iraq, and we worked with the Southern Iraq University in Basra. And you know, we're in the 16th year of the Iraq War today that the U.S. led. And so we was exchange program between artists and writers. And so I wrote a bunch of poems about Iraq, and then Iraqi writers wrote poems that then they shared, and we did a public reading. And I read all these poems about like, I was thinking about museums that had been destroyed. And so I wrote all these poems about sort of artifacts and whatever, and it was all destruction. And then the Iraqi woman's poem, Elham, who my friend Amir read, they were all about love. They were all about beauty. They were all about joy. And it was really interesting that it was like my perception of like thinking about suffering or war was one thing, but the experience of living through this destruction was about trying to get out of it, to find the poem as the place that can take you somewhere else.
Yeah, I think it's there's a lot that can be said for human experiences, because for people that have lived through certain things, you don't really care. Even if that trauma, even if that destruction is a part of you, but you don't really see it that much. What you're concerned about coming out, it's joy, right? Because it's like what's going to lead you out of that space, right? So even if you have these other things defining you, you have to just leave, right? So,
is poetry a joyful act for you?
I think it depends where I'm at the moment, but I think every poem leaves me happy, no matter how sad the content is, right?
The ones you write?
Both the one I write, both the one I read. Like, every poem for me, it's a moment of joy, because what it says to me is that the human experience is so rich that even when something is sad, you can produce this much beauty. And so it's a thing of joy to experience, like every book I read, every painting I see, every sculpture, everything is a thing of joy for me, because I'm thinking we're living in a very sad world, right? You have Trump in the US, you have the right wing movement seriously moving through Europe, you have migration, the slave situation in Libya, and all of this things going on, but the constant thing is like you still have lots of beautiful music coming out, right? You have lots of beautiful art still coming out of those things. So for me, it's a thing of joy and wonder to just exist and see these things, how beauty can come out of so much destruction. So it's in the sense where I still think, oh, okay, this experience is bad. This person is writing about this thing, that this experience is not supposed to happen in this world and this time, with the history of the world, knowing so much destruction have taken place, and we're still repeating history, like we've not even learned anything from the past, right? But the constant thing is like in all of this repetition, there's a different kind of beauty that comes out. So say the poetry coming out right now from young people, young poets, is a different kind of beauty for say poetry coming out like for example, Deaf Republic, Ilya Keminsky, his new book. It's so beautiful, right? But it's a sad experience. But you can take away the fact that there's so much beauty there. And so when I read something like that, there's this feeling of deep appreciation for living and life and beauty and art.
It's gorgeous.
Yeah.
I think that's like really the heart of the poetic experience. And like the poet is to reclaim that space, because I wish I was as joyful as you. Like I definitely feel a little more, like not just serious, but I feel more troubled inside, you know? And poetry for me is like just a space where you can like exist and like be able to hold that moment too, you know what I mean? Like for me, it's not just the joy, but it's actually like there's a space between all the chaos and sadness, and you can create like it's almost like a safe space, but like a space of like a breath, you know, like something that like emerges again that's still there, and it's vitality that it like regenerates, it can come back.
Well, every breath is also a thing of joy. It's also, there's no saying I'm alive.
Right.
So it becomes, because I don't, like for me, it's also, poetry is how I look at the world, right? But I'm a very pessimistic person about life, because I don't think, like most of the people tell me, oh, what do you think about, for example, the queer situation in Nigeria? It's going to get better. I'm always, my reply has always been constant, like, I don't think it's going to get better even if the laws change, because you still have people living on the streets. Like, you have to change the mindset of the people, not even the laws, right? Which is a difficult thing to do. So, but when it comes to like art, I'm like, poetry is just like this little space where, like a park for me, where you just put a kid, and so you're seeing so much beauty, right? Even if there's destruction going on,
right?
Because I think the world is too sad to also make your sacred space a thing of like so much tension. Yeah.
Interesting. That's beautiful.
I don't know.
You should put that in your next book. Yeah, your next essay.
So I'm curious what you guys think about like where poetry's going right now. Like, what's the future look like? What's exciting you? Other than,
I mean, I read backwards, man. Like, I really do. Like, I can't keep up. I can't keep up with what's happening. Like, you know, I like the archaic. I like the old. I agree with Romeo that like we haven't even woken up from history. You know, it's still like repeating. And I'm teaching like a history class, a labor history class right now, and it's so inspiring. There's so much material. There's so many things unexplored. I think one thing I really like, I was thinking about your internet question and social media, and what I like about the online is like archives and how much has been like been able to come out, and how much digitization, and that there's so much to explore from our culture that like we've looked over. And for me, that's like what I really am excited by, because I think, and I like to see poets who are using sources and pulling things out and making them visible again. I think it's really like that Tahimba Jess book, Olio, is like a really beautiful example where it's like a new work, but he's using all of this like archival material. He's using all this history of like minstrelsy and the poems. He's creating new forms, but he's using it through those past you know, cultural moments and icons and tangledness of American history. And I think that's, for me, like what's really exciting. That people are, you can have access to everything. And so I think that sense of informed writing is for me something I think really special.
What about you, Romeo?
I don't know. I think I'm a romantic at heart, so I'm always thinking like what's the future? It's just now. There's really like we would keep rewriting stuff.
Yeah.
Right. So even if because when I read Ilya Kaminsky's book, in my head I was like, oh, this is an old way of writing poetry, but with a new language.
Mm.
Right. And that's what I find interesting, because I'm always thinking about what's going to happen in the next 10 years in poetry and everything, but I think poetry would save itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not really bothered about what the future is going to be, or what's every day you have MFA programs turning out poets.
There's more poets than ever. Can I read a poem?
Yeah.
I wrote a poem about that. Besides, the laws of the peacock are stark, each eye a letter, an alphabet, each book a world, each book into the next, a cycle, sequence, chronology. Memorize Le Fleur de Mal before rejecting it entirely. A passage is a pilgrim. Each fortress of words opens the doors a micrometer more. For each book destroyed, someone will write it in another time or place. This is the symptom of eternity, endlessness, conduits of desire. I create a library out of everything I reject, an architecture of dismissal. Turn the watch with boxing gloves. Repeat the same cycles of longing. Mail is delivered today and tomorrow, but the man on the corner reminds everyone his prowess for beatdowns at daybreak, returns each morning to the same dirty corner. Don't call him crazy. He knows.
Oh, that's a lovely poem. I love the idea of every rejected thing it's going to be written somehow, and that's why I saw the future of poetry is assured.
I love it. I love to hear you say it, because I totally agree. Like I think it's important to acknowledge the forms are there and they can be remade. And that's like the joy of poetry, that there's so much material that you can take from and reinvent and play around with.
Yeah, because even reinvention is actually working towards the past.
Yeah.
Right. So like what's out, like whatever we're doing right now with poetry, like for example Jericho Brown's duplex form, and even the golden shovel, like Terence Hayes.
Yeah.
Like when I saw it for the first time, I started thinking of like Walt Whitman, right? His free verse, and the whole craziness of Leaves of Grass.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's just like for every new thing that we think we're doing, it's actually a reference to the past.
Absolutely. Did you ever read Oscar Wilde's last book, De Profundis, the letter he writes from prison? He goes to jail for being gay, and his lover betrays him. His lover's father betrays him, and he goes to jail for homosexuality. And he writes his lover this last letter from jail, and it's this long book, and it's a really powerful. I mean, it's a really intense kind of epistolary letter. But as I was reading it, I just kept feeling this sense of I've heard this before. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling. And then I realized it was James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room.
Oh.
And it was the same destruction of that relationship was in that Wilde book. And I was thinking about Baldwin must have read that book and been completely wrecked by it, or had his own relationship. And it was so interesting seeing that he created a complete new form, set in Paris, novel form. But it was the same sense of betrayal and hide. It was just it was really powerful.
It's also funny because I think as humans, in whatever form we express ourselves, there's always a conversation going on. Like every poem, every book, every song speaks to each other in a certain way. I remember when I started writing, after I published my first chapbook, and people were like, "Oh, dude, you're the first Nigerian to do this whole Awkward Team chapbook," right? And a few months after, I discovered a very young Nigerian who was publishing in the US he writes like a pseudonym, like his log in February, and I think you should check him out. Like he's a very, very powerful poet, right? Like we don't know each other, but we're writing the same thing from different angles, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, we're speaking to each other without even knowing each other.
That's awesome.
Right. So it's what fascinates me about life, the fact that we're connected even without knowing it. Yeah.
Respect.
Yeah.
Much respect on that. We're connected right now. We didn't even know it. I didn't even know Romeo, and now we're on the same press, and I can say Romeo is an Arrowsmith brother forever. I think it's rad.
Yeah.
And I agree with you too. Like, you know, that we're all trying to live. You know, we're all trying to like imagine. You know, trying to make it in this world. So like, we are connected in, you know, when you try to express that artistically in ways we don't know, and I think that's powerful.
So
That's some good like fraternity and solidarity that we forget sometimes. Because poetry feels so competitive, you know, or can.
Oh, I think I did a tweet that became this crazy thing. Like I was like, "Dear poetry, you're not in a competition with anyone." And
Yeah.
I think it's
You're not.
we need to remember. Like, I keep thinking, who's those poets who said it's a thing of joy to bloom, and like in old age, and if you bloom at all, you should be joyful. I keep forgetting her name, which is crazy because I hate erasure so much. But yeah, but I think we all what the world does is like we're living in a very strong capitalist world which wants everyone to like produce, and somehow the world of poetry annoys one person in different spaces to like the spokesperson, and everybody wants to meet up and surpass the person.
Yeah.
So there's this competition for like producing stuff even when you're not ready to produce, right? So I'm always thinking about that and how I can stay grounded even without that. Like I'm not even in competition with myself, right? So if I write, fine. If I don't, fine. The
That's
main
good,
thing
yeah.
is just to leave.
The
So what's
main
next?
thing is just to live.
What's next for you guys? You got a book? What's phase 2? I mean, you got news.
My full collection will be coming out next year with University of Nebraska Press, like the African Poetry Series.
Great.
Yeah,
What's it called?
Exciting.
it's called Sacrament of Bodies. So it's going to be my last.
Congratulations, that's huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, for a while, I've really been fascinated about bodies, like both like the outside and the internal space and what it means for like a human being to like live in certain spaces. So yeah, so it's just what came out of it.
It's great.
But like after this, I have to like talk about other things because I'm tired of talking about bodies for now. But yeah, but that's it. Then I'd also be going to grad school, get an MFA, and see what life holds after that.
Good for you, man.
Yeah, and I also want to travel. Like I envy you, like spending time in Asia.
Yeah, go teach. It's cool. It teaches you the language in a very strange way.
Yeah, I think teaching will also afford you the opportunity to see a different space. Like, because I'm interested in how like being in that space with seeing how a different like Buddhism and everything, how it shapes, especially your imagery. Like,
Yeah.
because it's the poets from that part of the world are really, their images are very different and strong.
Yeah. When I was in China, I asked the students what poems they learn as kids, and in the U.S. we learn like nursery rhymes. In like Nigeria, you have like much deeper stories and myths. In China, it was 6th and 7th century like Tang Dynasty poetry.
Wow.
And it's all just about spring and summer and fall, but they're these like iconic poems, and they remember that because they rhyme, and so they could recite them. And it was like this really beautiful image where it's like poetry is like ingrained in like the Chinese like spirit from the youngest age. So I thought that was really, really rad.
So Mitch, what about yourself?
Oh man, I'm gonna be inspired by Romeo over here. Like,
I think we all
like
are.
100%. Like no, the only job is to live. It is the job of the poet to live, and the poet must live as much life as they can live, because that is like the spirit we need to hold on to. Because I agree that we live in a very kind of competitive and destructive culture, and I think it is the ultimate protest is to live with joy.
So tomorrow's what's next?
Or what's lunch? Like, are you buying me lunch? Yeah, you gonna buy me lunch, coffee? No, I'm joking. Coffee is what's next.
Coffee's what's next. So on May 4th, we're going to be having a reading with these two poets and two other Arrowsmith poets in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You can go to www.arrowsmithpress.com for more information.